Millionaire CEO meets a waitress who looks exactly like his late wife. The truth shocks him. Carter Hudson, the man who had everything, money, status, a luxurious penthouse overlooking the city, was about to have his perfectly curated world turned upside down. But not by a business deal gone wrong, not by a scandal, and definitely not by an overdue tax bill. No, Carter's well-ordered life was about to be derailed by something far stranger. A waitress who looked exactly like his late wife. And how do you react when you meet someone who looks just like your lost love? Well, you could pretend it's a coincidence. Or you could do what Carter did. Stare for an awkward 5 seconds, then promptly spill your overpriced latte on your shirt. Perfect, Carter muttered to himself, trying to salvage his dignity as the coffee dripped down his front. Just perfect. Carter Hudson wasn't used to feeling uncomfortable. Not in the way he felt now, standing awkwardly in the small, cozy cafe. The soft hum of conversation around him only seemed to amplify his discomfort. The waitress had just handed him his coffee, straight from the most expensive artisan roaster in the city, of course, when Carter had taken one glance at her face and nearly choked on the sip he'd just taken. There she was. Same brown eyes, same delicate nose, same long, dark hair swept into a messy ponytail. The woman before him looked exactly like his late wife, Claire, who had passed away 3 years ago in a tragic accident. But it wasn't her. It couldn't be. "Sorry about the coffee," the waitress said, a slightly awkward smile tugging at her lips as she noticed the mess he'd made. She stood there, her hands fidgeting slightly, as if trying to decide whether she should offer a napkin or run for cover. No, it's fine," Carter managed, blinking a little too quickly. "Pull it together, Hudson," he thought to himself. "She's just a waitress, a random stranger, not some ghost." "Let me grab you another one," she added, already turning toward the counter. As she walked away, Carter couldn't help but stare. He couldn't figure it out. This wasn't some ridiculous fantasy or figment of his grief-stricken imagination. No, the resemblance was too uncanny. But what was even more bizarre was the way his chest tightened every time he looked at her. There were so many things about this situation that made absolutely no sense, but that was the least of his problems. Excuse me," Carter called out, still lost in his thoughts. The waitress turned, her brow furrowing in confusion. I'm sorry, but you look like someone I used to know." He immediately regretted the words the moment they left his mouth, but at this point it was too late. Her confused look deepened. "Are you okay, sir? You look a little pale." "I'm fine, really." He plastered a smile on his face. "It's just that you remind me of my wife." There was a pause, just long enough to make it incredibly awkward. The waitress blinked, clearly unsure how to respond. Carter realized he'd probably made the situation even worse with his bluntness. "That's strange," she said, tilting her head a little as she studied him. "I'm sorry, but I'm not sure what to say to that." "Yeah, well, me neither," Carter muttered. "Just forget I said anything." But she didn't forget, and neither did Carter. Over the next few days, Carter found himself returning to that same cafe, not because he had suddenly developed a newfound love for overpriced artisan lattes, but because, despite himself, he couldn't stop thinking about the waitress. She wasn't just a passing resemblance to Claire. No, there was something about her that triggered a strange, unsettling feeling in his chest. It was like seeing a shadow of his past, but one that he couldn't quite place. On his second visit, he made sure to avoid any coffee spills. And this time, he was ready with a plan to handle the situation, or at least seem less insane. "Hi," he greeted her, clearing his throat. I just wanted to apologize for the other day." The waitress looked at him, then at the cup in her hand, as if trying to decide whether or not to trust him. "It's fine. You're the guy who nearly drowned himself in his coffee, right?" Carter chuckled nervously. "Yep, that's me." She smiled, her eyes softening. "What can I get you today?" "A cappuccino," he said, but then, catching himself, added, "I mean, if you're sure I'm not a danger to the establishment." The waitress raised an eyebrow. "I think we'll be okay this time." She moved to the counter to prepare his drink, and Carter found himself just watching her. Her movements were so familiar, so reminiscent of Claire's graceful gestures. She wasn't Claire, of course. He knew that. But there was this unsettling pull, like a magnetic force drawing him in, tugging him towards something he wasn't quite ready to confront. Hey, he called out suddenly, before he could stop himself. What's your name? The waitress paused mid-pour, clearly caught off guard by the question. Emily? She replied, her voice cautious but polite. Emily, Carter repeated slowly, savoring the name like it was something precious. I'm Carter. Nice to meet you, she said, though there was a touch of wariness in her tone. She finished making his drink and handed it over. So, Emily, Carter began, setting the cup down on the table. He wasn't sure where he was going with this. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. You look like someone I used to know. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to figure him out. I've heard that before, she said dryly, before turning to walk away. Carter sat back in his chair, fidgeting with his napkin. He had to admit, he probably wasn't coming off as the most rational person at the moment. But he couldn't stop himself. There was a connection there, one that he couldn't explain. He needed to understand it, even if it meant embarrassing himself in front of a stranger. Over the next week, Carter kept returning. Emily's presence, the way she moved, the way her smile flickered on her face, continued to stir something in him. It wasn't just the physical resemblance. No, there was something else. A warmth, a kindness, an ease that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he'd thought. But he still didn't dare ask her about it directly. Instead, he resorted to his usual, more passive-aggressive tactics. One afternoon, as Emily brought him his cappuccino, Carter noticed her name tag. He smiled to himself, then grabbed his phone and began Googling. Emily, he muttered, under his breath, typing the name into his phone's search bar. He scrolled through the results, only finding a few generic mentions of other Emilys in his area. Nothing that stood out, no social media profiles, no personal details. His curiosity piqued. Carter leaned back in his seat, tapping his fingers against his mug. Was it really her? And if it wasn't, why did she feel so familiar? Everything okay, Carter? Emily's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Carter blinked, then looked up at her, his face flushing slightly. Yeah, just Googling stuff. She raised an eyebrow. Googling me? No, just, random things. Emily's lips twitched, a playful glint in her eyes. Right, random things. As she turned to leave, Carter couldn't help but smile at the playful banter. There was something so human about it, so real. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just coincidence. Maybe he wasn't ready to confront it, but the truth was starting to feel like an inevitable punchline to a joke he'd never quite understood. It was a Thursday afternoon when Carter finally decided to confront the growing sense of unease. He'd been coming to the cafe regularly, his visits increasingly filled with questions he couldn't answer. He had been trying to distract himself with work, with the bland routine of meetings and deadlines. But every time he passed by that cafe, his eyes would automatically search for her. Emily. It was becoming unbearable. That afternoon he had no plan, no carefully crafted words. His brain was clouded and he just needed answers. He walked in, his footsteps echoing louder than usual in the empty space. Emily was at the counter wiping down cups with a rag. Hey, Emily, Carter said, his voice wavering slightly, more intense than usual. She glanced up at him, offering a small smile. Hi, Carter. The usual. Actually, Carter hesitated, biting his lip. He didn't want to sound crazy, but he couldn't stop himself. Can we talk? Outside? Emily raised an eyebrow, but nodded. Sure, let me just finish this. As they stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, Carter felt a strange weight on his chest. The city seemed to quiet down around them, as though bracing for what he was about to say. I don't know how to ask this, he began, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. But I know what you're going to say, Emily cut in, her tone unexpectedly calm. She met his gaze, and there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition that took him off guard. Wait, you do? She nodded slowly. I do. I wasn't sure at first, but after a while, I realized it. Carter's heart raced. Realized what? Emily sighed, looking down at her shoes for a moment before speaking again. I know you're trying to figure me out. You think I look like someone you used to know. And you're right. You do know me. You just don't remember. Carter's mind reeled, the words hitting him like a blow to the chest. What do you mean? Who? I'm your sister, Emily said softly. Claire's sister. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment as Carter tried to process her words. His chest tightened, his throat constricting with disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The girl standing before him, the one with the messy hair, the playful grin, the quiet sadness in her eyes, was his sister? The sister he had never known existed? How was that even possible? Carter managed to choke out, his voice thick with confusion. Claire, she never mentioned you. We were married for years, and she never said anything about you. Emily stepped closer, her expression softening. I know. Claire and we had a falling out years before she met you. I wasn't around for most of her adult life. But after she passed, I did some digging. I tried to reach you, but I couldn't. So I found another way. Carter's head spun. Why? Why didn't you just tell me? I wanted to, Emily replied, her voice small. But I had to know for sure. If you remembered, or if it was just some strange coincidence. Carter stood frozen, trying to understand. But you've been working here? At the cafe? All this time? She nodded again. I thought if I just kept my distance and gave you space, you might come to your own conclusion. I didn't want to force this on you. Not yet. Carter ran his hands through his hair, the shock still pulsing through him. I don't know what to think. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I know, Emily whispered. But, Carter, I'm here now. And I don't want you to be alone in this. You're still grieving. I get it. Carter looked at her, seeing her for the first time. Not as a stranger who reminded him of Claire, but as someone who had been living a life parallel to his. Someone who shared his past, but who had kept her distance for reasons he still couldn't quite comprehend. He trailed off, struggling to find the words. This is too much to process. Emily reached out, her hand brushing his arm gently. You don't have to figure it all out right now, but I want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what. I've waited a long time for this moment, for you to see me for who I really am. For the first time in what felt like forever, Carter allowed himself to exhale, a weight lifting off his chest. It was strange, surreal even, but in some strange way, it made sense. There had been a void, a place where his past had seemed incomplete, and now, Emily was filling that space, piece by piece. I think I need some time, Carter said, his voice quieter now. But thank you for being here, for being real. Emily smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. And maybe we can start fresh. Carter spent the next few days in a haze. The world seemed both too big and too small all at once. He went about his routine, but nothing felt quite the same. It was as though he were seeing the world through new eyes, yet unable to make sense of it all. He found himself constantly thinking about Emily, the quiet woman with the soft smile, who was, in a strange way, his last link to Claire. But more than that, Emily was his sister, the sister he had never known, the sister who had been out there in the world, living a life just a few miles away, while he continued with his own. The silence was overwhelming. Every day felt like a countdown, like something was waiting to happen. But no matter how much he searched for answers, nothing seemed to fit the puzzle of his life anymore. Nothing except her. Then one afternoon, after another long day of meetings and disjointed thoughts, Carter found himself standing outside the cafe once again. His heart raced with the anticipation of seeing her, of understanding what this new chapter would mean for him. He could feel the pull, as though the answers to his questions were right in front of him. As he stepped inside, he found Emily behind the counter, just as she always had been. But today, there was something different in her presence, a calm that made the chaos in his mind feel quieter. Her eyes met his, and for a moment everything seemed to fade away. "Hey," he said, his voice steady. "Hey, Carter. How's it going?" Emily asked, her tone light but with an underlying warmth. I, I've been thinking, Carter said, running a hand through his hair, about what you said, about us. And I don't know if I'm ready to fully understand it all, but I think I'm ready to try. Emily smiled softly, her eyes glistening with something unspoken. You don't have to rush it. There's no timeline. We can take this one step at a time. But I'm not going anywhere, Carter. I want you to know that. Carter nodded, his heart heavy but strangely at peace. He had spent so many years hiding behind walls, pretending that everything was fine, when in reality, he had been alone. Alone. Even in a marriage that had meant so much. Now, here was Emily, an unexpected bridge to his past, a reminder of the things he had lost, but also a promise of what could be gained. I've spent so much time chasing the wrong things, Carter admitted, his voice a little softer now. Maybe it's time I start chasing what actually matters. Emily reached across the counter, her hand brushing his gently. You're not alone in this anymore. Not if you don't want to be. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Carter felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. There was something healing about this, about having someone who could understand. Someone who wasn't just a ghost from the past, but a person with her own story, her own life. I think I'm ready to build something new, Carter said, the words feeling more like a promise than a statement. Not just for me, but for us. Emily's smile widened, her eyes bright. And I'm here for it. We'll take it slow, but we'll figure it out together. As they stood there, in the cafe, Carter realized that life had a way of surprising you. The people you least expected to come into your life were often the ones who changed everything. He had spent so much time focusing on the things he had lost, but in that moment, he realized that what mattered most was the future they could build together, one step at a time. With a deep breath, Carter smiled, a real smile, one that came from somewhere deep inside. He was no longer running from the past. He was ready to embrace the future with Emily by his side. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be more questions, more doubts, more moments of uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, Carter felt hopeful. And that, he realized, was the start of something new.